gang, JuliaMUsher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. We have another raining and thundering day here today, which is no surprise. That's how our spring and summer have been. But fortunately, I'm working on some tiny elements today that are not nearly as humidity sensitive as some of the other big 3D projects I work on. As a reminder, I am going to be showing you all the little doodads that I put on my Live Sweetly set recently. Lots of bakery themed items that are teeny tiny miniatures ranging from maybe 1/8 of an inch on up to 1 inch max. Let's talk through what you're going to see today. Each is going to have its own little mini video within this video. I've got hand-shaped breads to varying stages of completion here. These are made with royal icing putty, very thick royal icing, not fondant, and then airbrushed for shadowing. Then we're going to move on to some royal icing elements that are piped. These are piped, not yet shaded yet. We're going to hit them with an airbrush and give them a little more dimension. Little mini macarons and open-faced tartlets, all piped with royal icing. Moving on to more royal icing doodads, we've got pies in varying stages of completion. The bottom crust, topped with chocolate cream. The crust, or rather the edge of the crust, now piped on. And then a few little embellishments and hand-painted shading on the crust in the final form here. Then moving on to fondant elements, I'm more of a fan of royal icing, but there are some things you can do with fondant that you just can't do with royal icing. And those are some of these molded forms, little strawberries, which do have royal icing greenery on them. Extruded little fondant rolling pins with royal icing handles. Moving on to some other embellishments, the next set of 3 to 4 will all be stenciled using my Live Sweetly set, which is the same thing I used to create the background for the bakery themed cookies that you saw in that earlier video. They will consist of some done on rolled fondant. Messages, perhaps some little cupcakes are done the same way. These are all flat, by the way. Flat rolled fondant. Then we'll move into some fondant pieces that are not flat, but are rather contoured, airbrushed, stenciled, and then contoured. And these create little dimensional baskets into which some of these other items over here can be inserted. And then we've got more dimensional elements, airbrushed and stenciled, these little canisters, which actually started with a royal icing transfer, which then got airbrushed and stenciled. I also have some done up here in rolled fondant that are flat, so you can see the difference. These guys are really thin. The royal icing just gives a little more dimension to the piece. So in this last container, I've got some super special items that are super teeny as well. Here on this side, I've got royal icing transfers that are supposed to be little mini egg yolks. I show them in use actually on a cookie at the end of my video that shows how to use the 2 dynamic duo sets together. So check that out if you haven't seen it already. And over to this side, I've got little dimensional royal icing spatulas. Everything from handle to the blade of the spatula is completely royal icing, super delicate, and you can see I can pick it up now that they've been joined. They're a 2-part piece. They've got a little dimension and lift to them as well. These are so special that I will probably reserve them for a future video. Plus, we've got so much ground to cover today with all these other pieces. So let's put those aside for now and focus back on where we started with the molded royal icing putty breads. So for those molded breads, here's an indication of where we're headed. This little bread sticking out of the top. And that's that egg I talked to you about here on this particular cookie. Here we've got some of those breads in various stages of completion. Here they are molded and formed and allowed to air dry, so they're quite firm and they're ready for airbrushing. And here's another finished one that was airbrushed quite a while ago. The airbrushing color is kind of dull as a result. It'll be shinier when we do it fresh. And all of those things were done with this royal icing putty, which I keep covered because it dries out especially fast. It's super thick, pasty royal icing. I can mold it all pretty well without it sticking to my hands. I might need to use a little extra powdered sugar to keep it from sticking, but you can see it's nice and moldable. We'll need a little paring knife for also scoring marks in the bread, and also an airbrush system and some gold food coloring for the shading. So very few things and pretty simple. So let's get started with that. Okay, so start with a small blob of that royal icing putty. Dust your work surface generously with powdered sugar, and then shape this as you would like your bread shaped. I'm going to start with a French style bread, rolling it into a long tapered oval. I'm going to pinch that bottom edge a little bit more. And then while the icing is still wet, I'm going to score it with a paring knife. You could do straight lines or small crosses. You can get a variety of different breads just by how you mold or model, I should say, the royal icing putty and score it. To show you another type, here's a small round bread. I'm just going to roll it into a ball in my hands. Plop it onto the work surface, pat it gently, and then score it. And then I'm going to let these pieces dry completely, probably a couple of days until they're dry all the way through before we airbrush them. To airbrush them, hold them in place with a trussing needle because they are light and will otherwise blow away. I'm using a gold airbrush coloring a mixture of brown and yellow and spraying at a distance a little bit from the top, but mostly from the side to give that sense of depth. Here again, just repeating the process on the small round bread until I get the desired shading. The longer I go, the less yellow the coloring becomes and the more brown it becomes. And that's really all there is to it. And again, depending on how you shape it and score the breads, you can get various different styles. So in this little section of the video, we're going to move from the molded or modeled royal icing work to piped royal icing work, and I'm going to cover 3 embellishments, 2 of which are well represented on this cookie again. I've got the little macarons, which are 2 sandwiched royal icing transfers filled with piped royal icing, and then I've got this piped challah bread and croissant, which are piped similarly with an icing of outlining consistency. And by that I mean an icing that clings to the spoon, but with a few little shakes will plop off. We want it thick enough that the icing holds definition when it comes up against the icing I'm piping next to it. So I'll start with those challah breads, but the third element before I do that are these cute little royal icing pies. They start with a bigger royal icing transfer made much the same way these small ones are made for the macarons, but then I invert it when it's dry and I pipe other stuff on top. So ultimately we end up with a piece that looks like this little mini pie. To do these piped pieces, the macarons and the pies, you will need some piping templates. Usually I just draw grid lines across, this being the width of the pie, this being the width of the macaron, roughly. They could be whatever you want. And I pipe directly on these acetate sheets that are supported with cardboards. And we'll similarly pipe the challah and croissants on acetate. And I have the cardboard on it just to give some added stability. So once I pipe this stuff, I can move it away and do something else. So again, I'm going to start with this guy and we'll move forward from there. Okay, so I'm going to try to replicate some of the shapes you see here, starting first with a croissant, using my outlining consistency icing and just piping a bead to start, and then a series of little circles, if you will. I don't love that croissant because it's a little too tiny and there are too many twists in it. It doesn't look as lifelike as it could, but let me finish it off by tapping down the bottom with a damp paintbrush. I'm going to open up my tip and now pipe one that's a little thicker with fewer swirls, and I think that'll be a little more lifelike. Because the icing is thick, it leaves a peak, and again, you want to just knock that down with a paintbrush so it looks a little more smooth. Moving on to the challah or braided types of breads. It's a similar motion, same consistency of icing. I start by piping a bead, pulling back, piping a bead to the side, pulling back, piping a bead to the alternate side, and pulling back, and continuing this zigzag bead sort of piping until I get to the very end. As I get to the end, I want to taper off, ease off on my pressure, so I get a narrower base that mimics the narrower top. And again, once at the bottom, I want to tap that peak out with my paintbrush. It helps if it's a little bit damp. Now, just repeating that process with a slightly more open tip to get a bigger bread. It's exactly the same. Push hard, pull back, push hard, release pressure, push hard, release pressure, and continue piping these V or braided shapes until the very end. Now set these aside to dry completely before airbrushing them. Because it's thick royal icing, but the piece is rather thin, it won't take more than a day typically. And you can airbrush these once a crust is formed, but it's easier once they're completely dry. Now, hold them down with a trussing needle or scribe tool as before, and spray a bit from the side and the top to make it look like it's been baked and to give it more depth and dimension, just as we did before on the modeled royal icing breads. The airbrush coloring will be very shiny to start, so if you want to preserve that look, it's best to put these on at the last minute before serving your cookies. I'm going to repeat that process on the croissant. It's exactly the same. Spraying at somewhat a distance here so I don't apply too much coloring all at once. It's always best to apply coloring gradually. And there you have it. Okay, the first step with the macarons and pies is to pipe their bases or surrounding pieces using this tracing guide, which consists of a piece of acetate, under which is a piece of paper with tracing guides which indicate the width of the piece we're going to pipe, and it's all taped to a cardboard for additional support once we're done. I'm going to start with the macaron sides. I'm using a thick flooding consistency, which will form a nice rounded shape, but I do need to tap out any peak that remains with the tip of my trussing needle or scribe tool. Sometimes it'll settle out on its own. For each macaron, you want to make sure you pipe two pieces that are completely identical because we'll be sandwiching them together. Here I'm going a little bit bigger and I want to make sure I have two of those pieces. That's great. And if I set those aside, they'll probably be dry overnight. Now I'm going to move on to the bigger pie piece, which is about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch across. Of course, you can do it any size you want. I'm using, again, the same consistency of icing now in a gold color, piping in a circular motion and then tapping the peak off at the top. You can do smaller versions of these too and create sort of open-faced tarts or tartlets like this one here. But we're going to move on and create a more complex pie with a crust. But first, let's go ahead and fill those macarons. Here are some pieces that have dried overnight and can be popped off the acetate. I've got some gold ones here that were airbrushed much the way the breads were to look like they were baked. But I'm going to go ahead and work with the pink ones, pop them off the acetate. Once dry, they'll fall off quite easily. And we simply want to invert one and fill it. I'm going to use a very thick brown icing to simulate chocolate cream. So I think it's easiest to hold the piece and then pipe the spiral. And then we'll very carefully set it down so fingers don't get in that chocolate icing or that brown icing, and then simply cap it off with another macaron halve. Don't press too firmly because you, again, don't want to squeeze out that icing, and you want to see some of the nice spiral effect from the side as you do here. Now let's move on to the pie. I've taken that big piece off and inverted it. So the next step is actually piping the chocolate cream. But to do that, it's nice sometimes to glue this down temporarily so it doesn't move around as we decorate it. I'm using, again, a thick flooding consistency, piping in a circular motion with dark brown icing to simulate chocolate. You could use any color you want. Just pushing it out to just within the edge because we need to leave room for a crust. I'm going to add a marbling effect by using the same consistency white icing and just running my trussing needle through it in a random way. I think that just adds a nice extra flourish. Now onto the crust, I'm using gold icing of outlining consistency that holds a nice firm shape. Using a beaded piping effect where I push forward to create a bead, pull back to create a tail, and make sure they're overlapping. I complete this process until I go all the way around. You want to let that dry completely and then we're ready to paint it. I'm using that same gold airbrush coloring we sprayed on before, but I can't spray it on here or it will get on the pie interior. So I'm just going to paint it on, holding it down with my trussing needle as I go so I don't have any missteps along the way. And that's looking super good. Again, that coloring will stay shiny for quite a while, so if you want it shiny, put it on your cookie right away. If you want it dull, you can wait a bit until it naturally dulls out. I'm using a thick white icing now to simulate whipped cream, using, I believe, a number 24 Atico tip, and just very, very small pressure because we want a very, very tiny dollop on top. And then while the icing is still wet, sprinkle on some red nonpareils to simulate little cherries. And that looks super sweet. So, having finished all the hand-piped royal icing embellishments, we're ready to move on to some molded and extruded fondant ones. I have an example of the extruded type here on this finished cookie, which is this darling little rolling pin. Extruded fondant forms the bulk of the rolling pin, and the handles are actually piped royal icing. And as for the molded one, we're going to be doing this really cute little strawberry. So the body of the strawberry is molded fondant, and the little leaves on it are piped royal icing. I'm going to start with the molded fondant strawberry because it needs a little time chilling or freezing in the mold in order to pop out of the mold. Then we'll move on to the rolling pin and then back to the strawberry. Okay, let's get the strawberry mold over here. This is a little mini mold, the source of which will be in the video description. I'm just packing a small blob of red fondant into each cavity of the mold, pressing just enough in so it's slightly beneath the surface and pushing pretty hard so I get a good impression. Now, if I try to get this out now, the fondant will most likely distort, so I'm going to stick that in the freezer and give it a little freezing time so it will pop out readily on its own. In the meantime, let's make the rolling pin. I'm going to start by mixing a little bit of brown liquid gel food coloring into gold fondant, not mixing it completely. I want a marbled effect. And then I'm going to roll it into about a 1/2 inch tube, a tube thin enough to fit into my fondant extruder. And this is what that tool looks like. The source again will be in the video description. Simply unscrew the end, stuff that tube of fondant inside, attach your extruding disc. I'm using a 1/4 inch round to make the width of the rolling pin, and then cap it off with a lid once again. And then to extrude the fondant, you just need to crank it with a lever at the very, very end. I'm going to crank out one big long tube and then cut it down to about 2 inches in size to make the rolling pin. And you can see that marbled fondant creates a nice wood grain effect once it's extruded. Looks pretty great. Now just trimming it down to size with my paring knife. I'm going to try to match this one. They don't have to be exact, but if you want to measure them, you certainly can. If the fondant flattens on the bottom side where it's placed, you can always roll them a little bit against the surface to round them out. Some of mine are a little flat on the side and I probably should have rolled them. I'm going to put on the handles now using royal icing. This is royal icing of beadwork consistency. I'm going to pipe a dot on each side, allow it to dry a little bit, and then pipe more dots on top of the dots, about 3 to 4 dots deep to create the handles. You could, of course, also do a royal icing transfer, use outlining icing, pipe a line, let it dry, and then glue it onto the rolling pin. But piping a series of dots is a much quicker process, and it looks pretty cute. If the handle is leaning up or down, simply knock it into a more level position with your trussing needle before you allow the icing to dry. Okay, those strawberries have been freezing for 5 to 10 minutes. You don't want to freeze too long or they'll sweat and get glossy, but you can see now when I invert the mold and pull back on the sides, the pieces plop right out without any distortion of the fondant. They look great. Now I'm going to actually trim this one up a little bit or push in the side to eliminate that bump, and then move on to adding the leaves on top. Here I'm using a Wilton 349 leaf tip and a very thick royal icing. To pipe the leaves, you want to push with a little bit of pressure and then release a bit on the pressure and pull back so the leaf comes to a point. I think the icing here could be a bit thicker to get more definition on the leaves, but we'll leave these as is and move on to our next piece. Now we're moving on to some embellishments that make use of my stencils that I used in my Live Sweetly Dynamic Duos video a couple of weeks back, and we're isolating just elements of them to create some beautiful dimensional elements. For the first one, I'm going to create a dimensional canister by selecting out this area of the background stencil of my Live Sweetly set. The first step will be actually piping a royal icing transfer in white, using the stencil to create the piping template. Then when it's dry, we'll remove it and stencil in red and brown. In this case, you could use any colors you want, but I'm going to use red and brown to create this lovely dimensional canister. You can see it's got some depth to it if I hold it to its side. Here you can see an example of it in use on the actual cookie. And just as a point of contrast, I did the same sort of thing by rolling out a thin sheet of fondant, stenciling it. Here I've got both canisters selected, but it doesn't have quite as much depth and dimension because it's just a thin sheet of fondant. So I'm going to show you the pipe transfer technique. Okay, let's move that finished cookie with canisters aside and pipe the actual canisters. I'm using a similar acetate setup to what we use for the macarons, except my piping template is a stenciled picture of the canister that's been airbrushed onto paper. I'm now working with a thick flooding consistency to outline the canister just within the boundary. We don't really want to go beyond, because if we do, when we stencil over it with food coloring, we won't capture the whole image. I'm going to immediately flood with the same consistency of icing to hide that outline, going all the way to the edge, like so. When we get to the corners, you'll want to take your trussing needle and tease it in there just so you get a nice clean corner on each side of the canister. And when that's done, we want to set that aside to dry so we can stencil it. If it's at all wet, you can smush the transfer when you lay the stencil on top. I'm working now with a dry transfer using red food coloring at a very close distance because we don't want to get any red food coloring into the name sugar, because I'm going to do that in brown. My stencil, of course, is weighted down with magnets very close to the piece so that the stencil does not lift. Moving on to the brown, again working at close range with low coloring flow, and ta-da, there's the finished piece. There's this little piece of the spoon that appears on the bottom corner from the original stencil. In any final cookie construction, you'll probably want to cover that area with something else. On to my last two fondant, airbrushed, and stenciled embellishments. Again, these two embellishments also use my Live Sweetly Dynamic Duos background set. And specifically what I'm talking about are these little dimensional baskets, which have some curve to them. And also these little cupcakes, which are not curved. You can also do something similar to what I'm going to show on the cupcakes with a message set. So I've got a lot of little message plaques and things that I did the exact same way, and I'll show you that process in a sec. Here are those embellishments. Now on cookies, you'll see the little fondant basket here filled with some of the macarons and croissants that we did a little bit earlier. And then up here, you'll see the cupcakes just on top of the rolling pin here. So lots of fun ways to put these together. The two stencils in question that we'll be using are the background stencil of the background set, and just selecting out the basket piece here, cropping off the arms of it to leave just the basket shape itself. And then for the cupcake one, obviously we're going to be using this piece. You could do the same technique with any of these other pieces as well on the background set. Since we're airbrushing and stenciling, we naturally need an airbrush system. I've got my compressor on the floor, some things to hold the stencils flat as we're airbrushing on the fondant, either magnets and or trussing needle, some rolled fondant white, and then a sharp paring knife to cut out all the little shapes that we're going to be airbrushing. So let's start with the actual cupcake piece. It's flat and not as complicated as the contoured basket piece. Okay, the first step is to roll out white rolled fondant to about 1/16 of an inch thick. I'm using my pasta machine, starting first on the number 1 setting where the blades are widest open. Then I advance it to about number 4 to get the desired thickness. Now every pasta machine is a little bit different, so you'll just want to look for the thickness that you want to achieve. I want these appliques to be relatively delicate, so again, 1/16 of an inch is what I'm looking for. Cutting it down to manageable pieces, I'm now ready to airbrush, setting my stencil on top and weighting it down with magnets to prevent the stencil from lifting up. I'm going to apply 4 different colorings, starting first with pink at the top. I am working at relatively close range, about 1 or 1.5 inches away, so I don't get the pink and red into the cupcake liner portions of the stencil. Now onto those liners, I'm using gold, and then I'm going to add some highlights. I am weighting down additionally with my trussing needle because the stencil is lifting a little bit more than I like, and I don't want to get any underspray. Finishing off that brown, that looks pretty great. Now I just need to trim out the fondant while it's still pliable. I'm going to start with some broad coarse cuts to get the general shape, like so, and then I'm going to come in with the tip of my paring knife and get much finer cuts very close to the edge of the stenciled portion, like so. Now, as you cut, if you have any rough, bumpy edges, you can always press the side of your paring knife up against the edge of the fondant to smooth them out. Now, I just
would continue cutting around in this vein until I get something that looks like these cupcakes here. I let them dry completely flat for my application. Now moving on to the basket, it's different as I noted before because it's contoured so it can fit some of the macarons and other goodies we made earlier into it. Airbrushing in much the same way, weighting down that background stencil with some magnets, applying pink. You could of course use any other airbrush coloring, and then I'm going to come in very tight range and apply a stripe of red through the middle and at the bottom. You could use one color, but I think the added stripes look pretty cute. And I'm going to lop off the handles because they're just hard to trim around. You could leave them on if you wanted, but since we're shaping this, it's easier to take them off. I'm going to trim around it much as we did before, and the only difference here is I'm not going to dry it flat as I did the cupcakes. I'm going to actually form it over a piece of dried fondant, and I'm just going to shape it around so it conforms to the original size of the stencil. Here it is dried, and you can see it has a nice arc to it.
And that's a wrap. I just showed you 8 or 9 cute little bakery themed elements that can be used on their own on cupcakes and cakes or on cookies using my Live Sweetly Dynamic Duo sets. Of course, I'm partial to my sets and you can find them all on my partner's site, confectioncouturestencils.com. Till next video, live sweetly.